The year is 2006. Zinedine Zidane sparks controversy in the FIFA World Cup against Italy, Google acquires a budding website called YouTube, and the world mourns the loss of a profoundly loved wildlife activist, Steve Irwin. I, in particular, was hit pretty hard by his death. In Hollywood, however, both Bond and Superman return to the big screen, and the third X-Men movie gets mixed reviews. Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest dominates the box office, nearly doubling the earnings of the runner-up movie that year, Night at the Museum. But amidst the franchises and the kids' films of that year is a slice-of-life coming-of-age story from within the exclusive walls of the fashion industry. Today, let's take a walk down the aisles of Runway magazine and find out just what it took to turn the smash hit novel into the cultural phenomenon that is The Devil Wears Prada. The Devil Wears Prada started its journey as a novel in 2003, written by Lauren Weisberger, who depicts the journey of its protagonist, Andrea Sachs, getting her first job out of college to work for Miranda Priestley, editor-in-chief of Runway magazine. The book is semi-autobiographical of Weisberger's own time working for a woman by the name of Anna Wintour, who is the editor-in-chief of Vogue magazine in real life, where she worked for just under a year, having just graduated college herself. In the article, Lauren Weisberger, My Time at Vogue, It Was a Year of Being Yelled At, by Megan Agnew for The Times, Weisberger recounts her experience as a fresh Cornell graduate from Pennsylvania, being thrown into the pit with Anna after weeks of job applications that simply just gained no traction. Weisberger initially denied the position at Vogue, but HR sent her through anyway. In a quote, she recalls, "I remember having no thoughts about that, which in hindsight is crazy. I did not know what I was walking into, and that probably had something to do with why I ended up getting the job. I didn't know enough to be tongue-tied and to be terrified." Speaking on her impression of Wintour, Lauren went on to say that, quote, "She was extremely composed and very intimidating, in hindsight, and her office was beautiful, but I didn't have to take it in all at one point. It really wasn't until I actually started that I thought, where the hell am I?" Shortly after starting the job, Anna sent her, as she did with all new girls at Vogue, to Kyle at Oscar Blandy Salon to be fixed. The following year was a gauntlet of, quote, deep feelings of inadequacy, prompted by her coworkers' constant socioeconomic status checks and obsession with physical and fashion appearance. All worlds that Lauren was not a part of, nor was she focused on. And the cherry on top of it all was the constant torment of Anna's yelling and the requirement for Weisberger to be at her desk for most of her waking life. Now, after 10 months of torture, Lauren left her post at Vogue and joined up with the American Express publication called Departures, and set to writing a manuscript detailing the trials and tribulations of her time in the fashion world. She reformatted the story to follow that of Andrea Sachs, a recent graduate of Brown looking for a job, only to find herself in the desperate position of having to accept a role as a junior assistant to the notorious Miranda Priestley. In the book, instead of Vogue, the magazine is called Runway, and it's published by Elias Clark Publishing. Throughout the story of the novel, Andy struggles through nearly a year of torture until, after her roommate suffers a dramatic car accident, she quits upon another impossible task requested by Miranda and moves on with her life. At 23 years old, after having quit her own new job to finish the novel, Weisberger sold her work to a publisher and never could have expected what followed. The Devil Wears Prada shot to the stratosphere, becoming an instant bestseller and gaining far more attention than Weisberger ever anticipated, both good and especially bad. Within the media environment of New York City, there were vicious and personal attacks thrown at Weisberger for her supposed unearned hit piece on one of the fashion industry's biggest titans. But that was relatively short-lived. By the time the book was flying off the shelves, she'd already received a significant advance to start on her next novel, of which she has now written 8. But before she began working on her follow-up, work was already being done to take the smash hit from the page onto the silver screen. Let's find out how that went. Much of the tale of the development of the film is recounted in the bonus featurette, quote, The Trip to the Big Screen, in which members of the crew remark on their journey to the production. The first major player in getting the film made is that of Wendy Finerman, a film producer with other credits such as Forrest Gump and P.S. I Love You. Finerman spent 2 years working with a series of writers trying to reformulate the story of the novel into something that would work as a film. In the featurette, Wendy notes that the first hurdle was figuring out the tone of the film via the correct writer. They had a difficult time finding somebody who could balance the various tones that were in the story, such as quirkiness, with a broad scope of the fashion world. Lauren Weisberger was interviewed, amongst many other members of the cast, in an Entertainment Weekly video interview titled The Devil Wears Prada Cast Reveal Behind the Scenes History. And within that interview, she describes that the original script was missing the sharp humor that she was hoping to see emulated into the film. Now, 2 years in, as Finerman had been refining the script with multiple different writers, was at the point in development in which Wendy reached out to director David Frankel, with whom she had been trying to work together for nearly a decade. After having seen his work on Miami Rhapsody, increasingly impressed with his range of capabilities, such as on Band of Brothers and Sex and the City. Elaborating on his first impressions, David remarks in that Entertainment Weekly interview that when he was initially sent the script, there was something within him that reflexively reacted against it, in a near rebellious way. The script as it was written was a very satirical revenge story, and he did what he could over the following few weeks to get a meeting with the executives to give his vision of the film, which was that Miranda was not the villain, but a heroine of the story, which was in fact a coming-of-age story for Andy, learning what it took to be something great, and the compromises that it would require. David was encouraged through this by Wendy to investigate the text to find what he wanted to change. And when he met with the executives at Fox 2000, he affirmed that he loved the world and the character of Miranda Priestly, but when pressed, he noted that he wanted to change the tone, which he found to be too comedic in a lampoon sort of way, and believed that it didn't respect the character of Miranda Priestly enough, or the world of fashion. Frankel wanted to double down on the exploration of the fashion world and fashion journalism and explore the characters through that lens. And after hearing that, the board at Fox said, "Great, now find a new writer and get started." Wendy also confirms that from the beginning, she and David had a lockstep understanding of what was wrong with the original script, and what needed to be changed, just as Lauren had pointed out. But it wasn't until Aline Brosh McKenna entered the scene that they found the person who could put to paper what they were looking for this whole time. Wendy affirms that within just the first meeting, Aline had all of the answers they were looking for. Now, to Aline's recollection, Wendy and David had asked her to come in and just pitch her take on the story. She and David had hit it off and had a similar vision about where to go with it. David in particular felt Aline had a special insight, especially to the character of Andy. He notes that Aline was the first woman to work on the script and in many ways had lived through the events of Andy's story in her own life. Aline adds that she thought it was a good opportunity to tell a story of a woman coming of age in New York City, which is something that she had in fact experienced. Plus, she loved the title. As for the reworking, the group wanted to pull out the most relatable story that they could, so no matter who was watching, they would be able to relate to Andy's experience on some level. Aline used the book as a baseline for knowing where the identity of the characters were, especially considering the audience had already connected with them so much, but she and the rest of the production staff knew that they needed to rework the structure and tone. One rule of the rework that Wendy recalls was that the script could never be funny for the sake of a joke. It had to be humor that was rooted in reality and character. And Aline adds that she and David found it important to effectively follow Andy's journey, especially in the beginning, in a way that could convey the overwhelming sense of a first job, even for people who have never stepped foot in the fashion industry. David elaborates on this by explaining that from page 3 onward in the book, the reader finds themselves rooting for Andy to quit, and he felt that such a situation would never work in a film. So they needed to change Andy from someone who consistently didn't want to be there to somebody who gets seduced by the world that she's inhabiting. He adds that part of this journey is how at the end of the film, Miranda notes that she sees a lot of herself in Andy, marking how she is on a path of sacrifice that is transforming who she is, which he adds is not in the book, and he believes is what gives the film both its comedy and its dramatic weight. And this seems to have worked because Lauren, in reflection on the script by comparison to the book, really enjoyed the way Aline changed things, and added some of the sharp humor that she was hoping to see in a film. Piggybacking onto that, Aline adds in the Entertainment Weekly interview that she had a lot of trouble getting in touch with anyone in the fashion world because they were all afraid of Anna and Vogue. But inevitably she was able to get one person to talk to her, who she says she will never disclose, and she got one critical point of feedback on her draft at that time. Quote, "The people in this movie are way too nice. No one in that world is too nice. They don't have to be, and they don't have the time to be." After that, she did a pass to make everyone busier and meaner. Now, in relation to David's insistence on there being a sense of respect for the fashion industry itself within the story, they decided to add the monologue at the beginning of the film about the two belt buckles, often called the cerulean scene. David notes that with all the fast language of fashion in the industry, such as "this is fabulous," "this is hideous," "these things are too similar," etc., etc., as an outsider, it can sound all very silly at times, but they felt it was important to give the audience both the nod of that understanding, while also providing an explanation as to how and why in these circumstances fashion can and should be taken seriously by showing the journey of a fashion item from starting out as a selection by an editor and following it until it finds the end of its journey, in the type of department stores from which Andy shops. Another change that David was insistent upon was that Miranda in the book is very demanding and mean without any form of what he called seductive qualities. Whereas, he notes, Meryl herself has innately seductive qualities, and that Meryl understood from the beginning that there had to be a blend of the two within the character. Aline adds that in her discussions prior to the production of the film, Meryl wanted to stress Miranda's efficiency, and how high-performing she is, and how tough the world is on women like Miranda, and how they are scrutinized in a very different way than men in those same circumstances. Part of the way in which they did this, again at Meryl's suggestion, was to show her legitimately working as much as possible during the film, grounding the understanding in the audience that Meryl is in this position for a reason. Aline notes in the Entertainment Weekly interview that Miranda had to not only be a very difficult boss, but also embody a certain value of people being expendable in service of what she views is the greater goal, and that the character really venerates fashion and the magazine. David also adds that the vulnerability of Miranda, especially through the plot point of her husband leaving her, was an idea brought up by Aline during the writing, and he loved the fact that it was yet another peek behind the curtain. A curtain peekingception, if you will, even if only for a moment. As for further details of additions during the writing process, David brings up the coat montage in the film's commentary, which Aline confirms was in the script. Patricia Fields, the costume designer for the film, adds that for her it was like a fashion show of coats, which helped show that period of time passing, considering it was about like 45-ish coats, so that's, a few months of coats passing by in a few moments. And David confirms this, that the story in that montage is supposed to cover about 2 or 3 months in Andy's world. Mark Lavolsi, the film's editor, adds in the commentary that this also shows the initial defiance by Andy of Miranda, but by the end, she's begun to get a bit more sucked into that world. Aline also notes that the Harry Potter sequence was inspired by the book, where she just had to get a copy from London to New York in a few hours, but they decided to make it a little bit more dramatic for the film. She attributes the idea of the train scene as being from David himself, and for those who weren't aware, the au pair is in fact the novel's writer, Lauren Weisberger. Speaking of David, he recounts that the idea to have Miranda choose to have Andy come with her to Paris was not in the book, but they turned the happy accident in the book into a choice for the plot. This was the moment where Miranda comes to Andy's desk and says to ensure Andy tells Emily that she's taking her place. And David said this was inspired by something that he saw on, of all things, Project Runway. They had had a challenge of finding a way for Anne to have her cake and eat it too, so Emily didn't have the chance to fight back, but that problem was solved via the car accident. He also states how there was a big debate about how injured to make Emily, so it was realistic, but not life-changing. And David concludes that the plot of the film is a bit of a falsehood, because though designers and editors travel with an entourage, it would be highly unlikely for them to bring their assistants to Paris. Now, given that I've mentioned some names already, just as they did as they were refining the script before pre-production, let's jump over to one of the most cherished parts of this film, the cast. We truly have a sky full of stars in this film, but I think it would be disrespectful to start with anyone other than Meryl Streep herself. Let's not pretend like you don't know who Meryl Streep is, but you may not know that she is a Yale-educated New Jerseyan, with 3 Oscars to her name, and if I counted correctly, 18 other nominations. Now, at the time that Prada was being made into a film, Meryl was in what might surprise you to be somewhat of a downswing in her career. At least that's what many have called it. Though she was still greatly successful and working with superstars like Al Pacino and Philip Seymour Hoffman, she was riding a lull since the roughly early 90s as a result of some unexpected flops at the turn of that decade. Despite it, Meryl notes in the Entertainment Weekly interview that she wasn't interested in doing a biopic of Anna, the basis for the character of Miranda, but she was interested in her position in the company, so she wanted to take on all the burdens she carried, while also having to look nice every day. In particular, she was intrigued by the existence of a career woman at the top of the pyramid and felt, especially at that time in the mid-2000s, that she was an important character to see and explore in pop culture. As for the protagonist of the film, Hathaway, believe it or not, wasn't the first choice. Fox 2000 had their eyes dead set on Rachel McAdams. Now, David confirmed this in the Entertainment Weekly interview that they offered the part to Rachel 3 separate times, as the studio was very determined to get her to do it. And she was very determined to not do it. Despite it, they offered the part to just about every noteworthy leading lady in Hollywood, but none ended up having the passion, let alone interest, in this project like that of the Princess of Genovia herself, Anne Hathaway. Now, Anne was still very early in her career at this point, only just having made the switch a couple years prior to more adult films like Havoc and Brokeback Mountain. The subject matter of this film was a bit of an opportunity to blend the tones of her previous work into one role, a coming-of-age story for a young woman. Now, Anne recalls in that Entertainment Weekly interview that beyond the typical reasons that you'd expect for her to want to do this role at the time, such as getting to be Meryl Streep's assistant, she found that it was about a subject that she took seriously, but in a joyful and lighthearted way. Elizabeth Gabler, the president of 3000 Pictures from Sony Pictures Entertainment and formerly the president of Fox 2000, remembers in the Entertainment Weekly interview that Anne was sitting on her sofa in her office explaining why she had to do this role, with some script notes that she says weren't exactly where they went, but despite not having any direct involvement with that script, she showed that she was very much in line with the direction that they were taking the film. And David adds in that same interview that he found everything about Anne to be perfect for the role, and so they started negotiating a deal. But that negotiation did not go well with the studio. Anne adds that she very patiently waited until it was her turn, and when she finally got the call with the offer, she literally jumped for joy in her living room and screamed, quote, "I'm gonna be in The Devil Wears Prada!" And she adds that she just had this feeling that this movie was gonna be huge. Now, interestingly enough, despite me not having mentioned her up until now, David and Wendy discuss in the film's commentary that Emily Blunt was actually, in fact, cast before Anne was, and that despite the part not being written for her specifically, or even a British actress in general, her audition synced with the character immediately. Emily recalls in that Entertainment Weekly interview that she got the call from David about the project when she was out at a nightclub of all things, and as the bass was thumping around her, David was yelling through the phone asking, "Can you do it again? Can you do what you did in the audition again?" Aline recalls in that same interview as well that when Emily came to the table read, she absolutely loved how funny Emily was. And when she did the read in her natural British accent, she suddenly felt as though that's exactly who the character should be. So afterward, they went to a coffee shop and they went through the script and added in a bunch of what she called British-isms, and Emily would tell Aline how she'd say certain lines, a process that Aline found very fun. Emily also recalls that she thought the character being British would be more imperious and cunning, which she just thought had something very funny about it, which David also happened to like. Now, moving forward a little bit, David notes in the commentary that Gisele Bündchen, I believe is how you pronounce her name, who plays Emily's friend in the film, is in the film specifically because Aline just happened to bump into her on a plane ride and asked if she wanted to be in it. Now, Aline adds to this story in the Entertainment Weekly interview that when trying to get Gisele to do the film, she reached over the person between them in the seats on the plane and, quote, "As to not sound insane, I just kept repeating the words, Meryl Streep, Meryl Streep, Meryl Streep, movie, Meryl Streep, movie, Meryl Streep," which, of course, obviously. Gisele remarks in the interview that Aline was telling her about the movie and asking if she wanted to be in it, and initially Gisele wasn't really interested in being an actor, specifically saying that if she were to do it, well, she wouldn't want to be a model. She wouldn't want to play herself, and Aline asked what she'd want to play, and Gisele said, quote, I don't know, could I be an assistant or something? Like, could I do the other side of things? And Aline responded by saying, yeah, sure. And that was how they got her in the film. And Giselle also adds that after her little bit where she says that Andy looks good, after Emily jests with her response of, what, she does, happened to be improv. And that was one of the moments that surprised a lot of the people on the production of how naturally she was capable of acting, despite not really having a lot of experience. Now, Wendy adds in the commentary that Stanley Tucci came to the production rather late, as they were looking for a Nigel and just couldn't find one that worked. And she and Pat agreed that they could not have found anyone better other than Stanley. Now, Adrian recalls his casting process in the Entertainment Weekly interview, noting that David sent him the script and he loved it, finding it a page-turner that he couldn't put down. And looking back on it, he considers it a once-in-a-lifetime project, and he was pleasantly surprised about how much of a monstrous success it was. Now, Aline mentions in the commentary that the character of James Holt was not in the book, and he was purely created for the film. And David adds that he was played by Daniel Sanjata. They'd originally met with him to play Nigel, but he really wasn't interested in that part because he had just played a similar character. And they struggled to find something for him until Aline suggested the idea of him playing Holt. Now, Wendy also specifies in the commentary that James McNaughton deserves attention, the man who plays Miranda's husband in the film, as he initially had 3 scenes done, but only one actually ended up making it into the final cut of the film. Another character in the film is Andy's dad, played by David Marshall Grant, who, along with being the dad in the scenes and in Andy's family photo, is actually accompanied by Anne's actual mother in that picture, which is a nice little tidbit there for you. Also of note is John Rothman, who plays the editor at the end of the film, who is interviewing Anne to work for the actual newspaper, who happens to be an old friend of Meryl's, whom she went to Yale with. And David had actually previously worked with him on a project called From the Earth to the Moon. And now we get to a fun face that I always enjoy seeing in this film, and that is of Simon Baker, who plays Christian, the sly blonde writer who's the tempter of Andy throughout the film. Now, my first introduction to him as an actor was in what is possibly one of my top 10 favorite television shows of all time, The Mentalist, as the charming Patrick Jane. Some other actors of note in the film are Tracy Toms and Rich Sommer, who play Nate and Andy's friends. Now, relatively inconsequential to the actual film itself, but a fun little tidbit nonetheless, David adds that there was a big question about who was going to replace Andy at the end of the film. And it was only at the last minute that they were able to cast the part. They had the extras department round up about 10 people in a dance hall in Times Square, and they had to choose this woman, for whom it was actually her first time acting. David remarks that she went to work that morning, working as an assistant at Sellerby's, and wound up working in a film with Emily Blunt, Meryl Streep, and Anne Hathaway. And Wendy remarks that, ironically, that's where Anne went to work to prep for this film, at an auction house. Now that we have our cast put together, let's take a look at our first steps into the pre-production process. Now, first and foremost, this is a film that truly embodies New York, much like our last film of Taxi Driver, but at a very different time and in a very different way. Wendy Feinerman notes specifically that they wanted to make this a love letter to the city, so they set out to shoot in as many parts of it as they could. Now, Wendy adds that it was necessary to shoot in New York, as doing a film about fashion publishing anywhere else just wouldn't really work. David also ensured that even when they were inside, they could find a way to choose locations that they could shoot in, through which we could see as much of the city as possible out the windows. So, given that Manhattan was such an integral part of the film, let's run through some of the locations utilized through the production of Devil Wears Prada. Now, to go as chronologically as possible, David confirms in the commentary of the film that they shot on the Lower East Side with the models for the opening sequence, and the Upper East Side with Anne, adding that anytime they were shooting with Anne, they had the Clacker unit shooting in another location with the models. And for some clarification that I also needed, Wendy clarifies that the Clackers are the women who work at Elias Clark, and they're called Clackers because of the sound that their shoes make as they walk along the marble floors. Now, this is a term that is used in the real world for these types of women in the fashion industry. Now, as for the Elias Clark building itself, that's the McGraw-Hill building on 49th and 6th that was used for the external and lobby shots. Now, here we're going to introduce Florian Ballhaus, the cinematographer for the film, as he confirms amidst the chaos of discussion at this point in the commentary that the walk and talk in the upper halls of the runway offices is a transition from a real-world location in the News Corp building in New York into the set that they constructed. And David goes on to note that the following dinner with friends was shot in Bubby's restaurant down in Tribeca. Later, when Andy goes to get the Calvin Klein skirts, that was actually shot in the fashion district outside of the Calvin Klein offices. and apparently there was even a scene shot in their actual showroom that ended up being cut. The cafeteria scene was shot in the Reuters building in Times Square. Moving forward, Wendy notes that despite the fact that there was a lot of discussion and debate about whether or not Andy should be living with Nate, they did make a specific choice to not have it be an apartment that everyone would die for, like you'd often see in a lot of New York films like this at this time in the early 2000s or late 90s. Now, Jess Gonshore, the production designer for the film, went and took a lot of location scouting photographs to find what would be the right look for what Wendy calls, quote, classic railroad apartment on the Lower East Side for a real first apartment. And Florian adds in the commentary that it was important for it to feel authentic, like someone would actually live there, unlike some loft in Soho. He also adds that one thing he really liked is that they tried to avoid sets as much as possible. Of course, there are some, like Miranda's office, but they wanted the film to feel really authentically New York. And David adds that the dinner between Andy and her father was shot at Kraft Restaurant, and that they didn't change anything for the set dressing. That's genuinely just how the restaurant looked, and it's a prime example of good location scouting saving the production a lot of time and effort. Now, David goes on to discuss the Times Square sequence, noting that it was shot on a summer night on location with only a handful of background extras wearing winter clothes, and everything else is just what was happening in Times Square that night. They didn't close off any streets, they didn't do anything to augment the background, they just shot on a long lens and went with it. Now, Wendy adds that the next dinner scene with the friends is in Union Square, the one with the bag and the weird phone and people stealing Andy's phone, and David confirms that it's a coffee shop. And here in the commentary, he enumerates the importance of scouting locations where you could see New York in the background. Now, just as a little prop aside, Aline confirms that the Bang & Olufsen phone is actually taken from the book. Now, in terms of Holt's apartment, Wendy adds that this spot was a great use of locations, in which they ended up using a number of locations that were within about 5 minutes of each other in this area. David adds that this was a loft in Soho, and also a little tidbit that if you look closely, if you were familiar with any of the people of New York nightlife at the time of filming this, you would, in fact, see some cameos of those people there. Now, Wendy recalls that the day before the first scene at Miranda's house, they lost their location because they weren't able to set it in time. So they ended up having to use one of Wendy's college friends' homes, and they were there within 24 hours. Now, she says in order to preserve the friendship, they had to promise that they wouldn't change or damage anything. So they couldn't actually put any of the equipment down that they had. So they could barely use any equipment to the point where they even had to take all their shoes off. As a result, the crew was Hollywooding everything throughout the house, which, for those who may not know what that is, means that instead of using stands or rigs to hold lights or modifiers or anything like that, you just had to have a bunch of crew members holding stuff all over the place. Now, because of all the limitations, it means that all of the dressings that would normally be done are actually just the way that house looks, with a lot of the paintings and books being literal museum pieces. Now, for the montage scene, they shot at the actual Smith & Wollensky's in New York, and David's favorite production story was that the props didn't have a Smith & Wollensky bag, and when they were getting ready to shoot, it was 8 a.m., which is several hours before Smith & Wollensky's would actually open. So the production designer Jess went over and pried open the sidewalk grate in front of the restaurant and went downstairs and found somebody in the basement that was prepping for the day and managed to talk his way into getting a bag for use in the scene they were filming that morning. I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that, but these are some of the fun things that happen on film sets. Wendy also adds that the plate the steak was on was a Ernie's plate, and the prop department and David took great pride in breaking that one plate. Anne wanted to throw it against the wall, but they held off on that for the sake of preserving the set. And David supplements a lot of this information from the commentary in the Entertainment Weekly interview, noting that location-wise, for the event at the museum, while Vogue has the Met Ball, the Metropolitan Museum wanted absolutely nothing to do with the production, along with a lot of the apartment buildings in the city that they had approached. Wendy also adds that for the Parisian Hotel, they had a deal with the St. Regis Hotel that they could copy it from Paris, and that it had the most beautiful rooms, and it was a great match, with David adding that they were really great to work with. Now, the shot of Emily running on the phone through the streets of New York was shot on a long lens at Madison Avenue, and the hospital scene that followed was an interior shot at Lenox Hill Hospital in a brand new wing of the real hospital that just hadn't opened yet. Now, the art gallery where Andy's friend has her exhibit was shot in a clothing store in Soho. And moving forward, David notes that the divorce scene in which Miranda reveals that her husband just asked for a divorce, that hotel room is actually the presidential suite in the St. Regis in New York. And he continues to explain that it was fortuitous about this location, as they could light the building from across the street, which was seen in the window in the background, and it looked like Paris despite being around 58th, 56th Street in New York. And though we're not quite at that point of the video yet, I do assume, I don't know for sure, I couldn't find any details, I think that was like a street level HMI or an HMI grid that they were shooting to bounce off into the window, but again, I have no confirmation. That's just a total guess. Now, David and Florian both confirmed that the following hotel scene with Andy and Christian was shot in the Duffy Hotel in Times Square on the 7th floor, and they put a green screen out the window and used that as a plate of the Eiffel Tower. And they chose this room because they wanted a very different location feel for Christian than Miranda's room, one that was a little bit more angular and modern, and cold, partly for the relationship that was about to go south throughout that scene. Moving slightly forward, David explains that the scene with the exterior of the car with Anne and Meryl is in the actual Paris, but then as soon as they hop into the inside of the car, it swaps to a soundstage in Queens. And he elaborates that the final car exiting scene has actually 4 locations. There's the car in the studio in Queens, and then there's the plate in one location of Paris. And then when Meryl gets out, that's a set of steps in front of a building in New York. And then when we cut to another shot of Anne, that's another location in Paris. Wendy adds that the building that Meryl walks into during that sequence was actually the Historical Society, and it's at Central Park near 77th. She also notes that the fountain in Paris that they have Anne throw the phone into wasn't actually operating at the time, so they had Joe Cracciola clean the fountain and turn it on so that way they could use it for the film. And Florian recounts that in that scene with the Eiffel Tower and the skyline in the background, only 2 minutes after they got that shot, the tower completely disappeared from view because of how many clouds were occurring that day. David also confirms that the final coffee shop that Nate and Andy meet in is the Mayrose, and that the newspaper office is a real location as well. It's the New York Sun offices in Lower Manhattan. Now that we're through the notable locations in the film, let's discuss the elements that filled the gaps between real locations, the sets and the dressings created by the production design team. To start off, let's go back to the beginning, when Andy and Emily are walking through the halls of Runway. David notes in the commentary that the racks of clothing are something that you see in these fashion magazine publication offices, and all the offices in New York have this wonderful feeling of going into a special world, like a bird sanctuary, he says. And they wanted to capture the gleaming white surfaces like a makeup compact as a metaphor for this kind of work. He also mentions that Jess built a false wall at the end of the News Corp hallway to contain it because the hallway in fact actually led to their cafeteria. In addition, Florian affirms that after the turn in the hallway, the film transitions from being in the News Corp offices to the runway set that they constructed. Florian also commends Jess for doing a wonderful job with the set of the runway office and having the glass behind the desks of Anne and Emily, so that way there could always be somebody moving around in the background of the frame to keep things dynamic, instead of just blank white walls. Wendy adds that Jess thought of Miranda's office like being a sanctuary, but you could at least see the business part of the rest of the office in the background. Wendy also goes on to note that they chose the screensavers for each of the characters' computers pretty early and pretty specifically, having Andy be Miss Nature and having Emily have the Arc de Triomphe because finally getting to go to Paris is all she thinks about. Beyond that, Wendy discusses that before they even began shooting the film, they shot all of the fake magazine covers for Runway, so that they could decorate the walls of the office appropriately. She also mentions how Florian addressed the change in time by having them working in the day at the beginning and then working at night, as with the year going on, it would naturally get darker earlier in the evening. Florian also adds that it was important to show the passage of time visually and add the different looks such as late afternoon, rainy days, and so on. David interjects and discusses getting ready to go back into the magical closet for Andy's makeover, partly because it doesn't actually exist, though Pat retorts that it does now in her store. Now David goes on to explain that though this set was constructed by Jess with the columns and a few shelves, it was actually a lot smaller than it shows to be in the film. And this is because of the magic of photography, which allowed the VFX supervisor Randall Balsmeyer, whom he calls Randy, to be able to make it twice as big as it really was. Wendy adds that the closets in the offices of the real fashion magazines are nowhere near as nice as this one, so they took a bit of liberty with the design here to make it feel special. And David adds that it was a key element in the book that people were curious about, so it was important to convey it in the film. Aline also adds that it signifies the detail that they have access to clothes before they come to market. Now, jumping to the day after Andy drops off the book and sees Miranda's domestic argument, Florian adds that this is one of the scenes where they changed up the weather with it being rainy outside of her office, which was also fit to the exteriors that they had previously shot, which happened to be rainy during the day that they were shooting. Jumping slightly forward again, David adds that the different fashion shows were all shot on one night at the same set that Jess had constructed, and they would simply just change them over. As a reference, David recalls that Pat brought him backstage at the Dior show when they went to Paris in pre-production, which was also in a tent in the back of the runway, and he wanted to recreate that. And speaking of fashion shows, why don't we hop over to something I'm sure many of you are curious about, and arguably the keystone of this entire film, the costumes. Now, in order to discuss the costumes in the film, it's important for us to go over some of the history of the costume designer of the film, and that is Patricia Fields. Now, in the costume design featurette of the film, Pat explains that she studied liberal arts in college, but didn't have a specific career picked out for when she graduated. And as she did, she saw an ad in the newspaper for a junior executive role in retailing, and she responded, thinking this is something easy and that she could probably do, but not really because she had any particular interest in fashion at the time. Now, she ended up working for 2 companies over a course of 3 years, and learned the ins and outs of the retail and fashion business, found out that she enjoyed it, and decided to open her own business. In 1966, she opened a shop on the campus of NYU, knowing that she'd have a captive audience of students, and after about a year, they were able to finally make a living from her shop. She catered to the kids at NYU, and as it grew, she was able to move from her shop at Washington Square up to 8th Street, even then still wondering to her partner Joanne how they could possibly fill such a large space. And of course they did, and for about 30 years that's where they stayed, until moving down to the Bowery. Now, as for her relationship with the film industry, Fields got into film in about the mid-80s through a good friend of hers named Candy Price, who was consulting on a movie directed by Karen Arthur, who asked Price if she knew anybody who could do the costumes for her picture because she wanted somebody from within the fashion industry rather than a costume designer. Now, Fields was hired for the job despite no experience and being intimidated by the whole process. But to her, it ended up working out pretty well, and it opened up a new creative door for her. After already having had her shop for nearly 20 years at that point, it gave her a new way to express herself through, and in a sense, a second career, while still maintaining that interest and focus in fashion. And this career is inevitably what led her to the production of The Devil Wears Prada, a project she joined specifically through David, whom she'd worked with many times before, and she enjoys his demeanor and work style, which is why they continue to work together. Now, David elaborates on their shared careers, noting that they'd worked together for 15 years up to the point of doing Prada, even as early as on his first TV series and his first movie. Now, Pat explains the complexity of the project was vast when she joined, but over time it only got more complicated. In the original script, there were tons of clothes, but then David started adding in all of these different montages, so the amount of costuming ended up going from about 40 outfits for Andy originally to upwards of 65. It ended up being a huge amount of wardrobe, acquired through a variety of means, such as borrowing, renting, buying, and a little bit of begging. And she adds that much of the loaning from designers came as a result of her standing in the industry, along with her and David's success and connections that they made through doing Sex and the City. Pat also adds that they did have a budget for the film, but to reach the levels that they used on this movie, if they didn't have friends, there was no way they could have made this film. Wendy also gives credit to Fields through her foresight, as they thought it was a very important thing to have somebody on the production who knew where fashion would be in 10 months, ahead of the shooting schedule at the time. So in the final scenes that we see Andy, her fashion would fit into the world as the film was being released, rather than feeling outdated by nearly a year. And Wendy attributes Pat to having known which direction that fashion would be going at that time, which is why Andy's final outfit is, as Wendy describes it, cigarette jeans tucked into boots. In another part of the features, Anne Hathaway describes their intended design for Andy, noting that they wanted to give her a very girl-next-door look in the beginning of the film, as if she were any normal woman that you'd see on the subway, and shopped accordingly for her wardrobe at that point in the film, at least to start. David then outlines the trajectory of Andy's fashion in the film, from having no interest or clue at the beginning to completely changing herself by the 30-minute mark. Upon which Anne elaborates, despite the change, Andy's style choices are fairly, quote, safe, in that she doesn't wear much beyond the middle ground of higher fashion. Now that's in stark contrast to Andy's counterpoint in the film, which is Emily Blunt's character, which is designed to be much more unique in her choices of wardrobe. Blunt describes the character of Emily as being so on the edge of fashion that she's practically falling off, remarking about the costume that she's in during the interview segment, which is the one that she wears in her first scene in the film, being as like, quote, a Star Trek type deal. Now, providing a bit of an overview, David adds that a key element in everyone's wardrobe is the shoes. But given that feet usually aren't a prominent thing to show in film, he applied a rule that he learned while doing Sex and the City, which was to do a lot of panning, starting on the shoes and panning your way up, or vice versa. However, despite that, Emily notes in the Entertainment Weekly interview how she and Meryl were often actually wearing Uggs in a lot of the shots where their feet were not shown. This is in contrast to Anne, who was steadfast, however, in almost always wearing heels. And Emily was impressed by the dedication, even if it did end up with Anne frequently tripping her way around New York. Now, Anne clarifies in that same interview that to her, Emily had such a better posture than she did that she felt she needed to wear heels in order to match wits with her. Now, in terms of the more specific information about the details of the wardrobe in the film, I very much encourage you to get the DVD yourself if you would like to know the outfit-by-outfit trivia details, as if I were to go through them here, it would be far more extensive than I think even you might enjoy in this kind of setting. But if you want to hear about all those specifics, I suggest you hear it from the sources within the special features. But as a high overview, I can confirm that there is a lot of Chanel, Valentino, Vivienne Westwood, Calvin Klein, and of course, Prada. There was also a consistent hierarchy of costuming in the film to ensure that the eliteness of certain outfits fit with the characters and their positions in the hierarchy in the story. Now, one specific element of wardrobe that ended up being pivotal to the film is in the cerulean scene. And David elaborates that it was actually very difficult to find two belts that were, as he puts it, the same but different, to ensure that both sides of that argument were actually right. And as a final point on costuming, David also adds that Simon's clothing here in the first scene in the loft is actually Simon's own clothing. And it was the outfit that he wore during his audition tape that he recorded in a friend's living room and sent over to the casting staff. They all loved the outfit for his character so much that they'd asked if he would wear it in the film. Now, with that general conversation about costuming finished, let's move over to the hair and makeup department. Now, if you weren't previously aware, you may be surprised to find out that there's more hair and makeup within this film than you might expect, specifically with one of the most striking elements of the film, Miranda's hair. Elizabeth Gabler recalls in the Entertainment Weekly interview that there was a lot of concern at first that Meryl was going to have white hair, but that Meryl ended up calling her and the other members of the team, saying, quote, "My girls, don't you worry. This is what I'm gonna do, and this is gonna be great." And they simply said okay. And David adds that, despite its seamless look, the silver hair is actually a wig, and elaborates that Meryl made the choice because she decided she didn't want to look like a suburban soccer mom. Pat loved the choice because it was a great thing to be able to pair with outfits. And David elaborates further that when Meryl would show up on set with the hair and the outfits, there really was a sense that Meryl was Miranda, and that everybody would bring their A game because there was just that sense of authority that she had. Now, as for makeup, David notes something that I find to be a particularly important detail, and that has to do with the lack of makeup in a specific scene. In the scene in the hotel room in which Miranda opens up to Andy about the divorce that she has just found out about, it was actually a shock on set to people that Meryl was so committed that she didn't wear any makeup whatsoever in that scene, because she really wanted it to be as authentic as possible. Now, this is considered a large commitment and somewhat surprising to people in the film industry then and even now, because with a lot of the pressure on women in the film industry and society at large, to be able to be confident and comfortable in not wearing makeup in such a prominent scene in a prominent film by a prominent actress, it's bucking the norms that a lot of people feel that they have to abide by. And I personally love that. I think norms need to be bucked a little bit more often because I think we follow them a little too strictly. So I, along with David and many others, commend this choice in the performance. It only added to the scene, and I think women not wearing makeup should be something that is a little more normalized, because personally to me, I really don't think it's that big of a deal. Granted, I'm a guy, so, you know, I can only say and judge so much, but I can only hope that more women feel more comfortable being able to wear less makeup than they may feel like they need to in a given situation. Now, another major makeup character in the film was Emily, specifically with her unique looks incorporating colors of eyeshadow and other elements to her look. The makeup supervisor, Nikki Letterman, changed the makeup almost every day to go with whatever Emily was wearing, which really helped to distinguish her character from everyone else in the film. And David adds that Angel Daniels really worked a lot to get the right shade of red for Emily's hair as well. And Wendy gives specific credit to the makeup department for a slightly different reason, specifically the fabulous job that they did in making Emily look sick during the editorial meeting scene and subsequent sick scenes, especially like, quote, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And with that, let's take a step into the technical elements of the film within the camera department, one of my favorites. Now, The Devil Wears Prada was shot on the ARRICAM Studio, or ARRICAM ST, on both Kodak Vision 200T and 500T through Angino Optimo zoom lenses and Zeiss Ultra Prime lenses. Angino Optimo zoom lenses were also utilized on the productions of Skyfall, Get Out, Hacksaw Ridge, The Day After Tomorrow, Killers of the Flower Moon, Once Upon a Time, Law & Order, Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, and many more. And the Zeiss Ultra Prime lenses were also used on Skyfall, The Day After Tomorrow, Lord of the Rings, Law & Order, Narcos, Mindhunter, The Flash, The Expendables, Doctor Strange, Stuart Little, Pretty Little Liars, and many more. As for comparable films shot on Kodak Vision 200T or Tungsten 5217/7217, you can find examples in Quantum of Solace, Breaking Bad, True Blood, Shutter Island, Doubt, No Country for Old Men, Jennifer's Body, Pirates of the Caribbean: Dead Man's Chest, Terminator Salvation, There Will Be Blood, and National Treasure: Book of Secrets. Now, the examples of Kodak Vision 500 Tungsten 5218/7218 can be seen within Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, The Prestige, Grey's Anatomy, 500 Days of Summer, Watchmen, Pirates of the Caribbean: At World's End, Spider-Man 3, Van Helsing, Transformers, No Country for Old Men Again, Pride and Prejudice, and the show The Mentalist, from which you may recognize our friend Christian, as I mentioned not too long ago. Now, the final aspect ratio of the film is 2.39:1, and optimum quality releases are in Dolby Digital and Sony Dynamic Digital Sound. Film development and color timing were provided by Deluxe and Technicolor. Now, Florian adds an interesting detail in the commentary that they supplemented the 35mm primary photography film with 16mm at certain times, to mix up the texture amongst the film 5 final print. Now, as for pre-production camera work planning, David remarks to Florian in the commentary about how they attempted storyboarding early on in the process, but it ended up being short-lived, though they were grateful for it, and I personally assume off their tone in the commentary that this was largely because the level of drawing ability by David probably prohibited a bit of usefulness of the storyboards, and Florian adds that he believes that it was for the best no matter what, because storyboards really wouldn't have worked well for this kind of project, as they ended up finding a lot on the day. Now, with the details of the pre-production for the most part covered, let's finally transition into what it was like to be on set for the official shooting of this film. Now, the first thing that I want to focus on during the discussion of the production of this film has to do with something that doesn't usually get a lot of attention from behind-the-scenes features on a film, and that is focusing on shooting schedules. A shooting schedule is how each day of the film is scheduled to be shot. Said in another way, it's organizing what scenes or even what specific shots will occur on what days of the production. So with this production being 57 days long, you're taking the script, you're breaking it into scenes, and then you're breaking those scenes into shots, and you're figuring out on what days each of those individual shots are going to occur within those 57 days. Now, some of you may be aware of the fact that films are not usually shot in chronological order as they're written in the script, but not much focus is given on why this occurs. Now, the reasons for not shooting a film in chronological order are bountiful, but often mostly have to do with mundane limitations of availability, such as an actor's schedule or access to a specific location, or even something like a season of the year. So for this project, let's go through some of the information provided in the commentary of the film that provides some context about when and how certain elements of the production were achieved, and why it was done in such a way. For a start, the crew in the commentary confirmed that the opening scene of the film was a combination of one of the first days of shooting and one of the last days of shooting. And part of this has to do with an aspect that David considers a fantastic thing about the production, which was the fact that they could use a second unit to get shots like the clackers getting ready in the beginning, or the shot of the train with Miranda's kids and Lauren, which they normally wouldn't as easily be able to get on a film like this. Now, moving further into the film, David adds that for the scenes in the assistant's desk area, Meryl essentially worked as an extra for 2 days at the beginning of the production schedule to provide cohesive background. Part of this includes the scene of Miranda and Andy's exchange at the end of the film while they're on the street as Miranda's getting into the car, which David confirms in the commentary was actually one of the first days of shooting at all, and remarks how great they both did for being so early in the production, despite there being absolutely no dialogue. One of the first scenes where Meryl actually had dialogue in the schedule was the fight she had with her husband in the apartment that Andy interrupts. Now, relatedly, David notes that the scene in which Miranda tells Andy that she wants her to come to Paris in Miranda's home was actually the first scene that Anne and Meryl had worked together with actual dialogue, and Anne adds that she was extremely nervous, which David thinks added to the scene. This kind of tension between the continuity of character performance and the shooting schedule is also displayed in the relationship between Andy and Nigel. David notes that the scene between Anne and Stanley in the hotel room, where she mentions the size 4 thing and they discuss his potential promotion, was actually the first night that Stanley worked on the project. And he adds that it was very intimidating for Tucci because he was just finding the character still. And it was still very much a question of how extravagant Nigel would be. And Wendy adds that the final details of his look, with his shirt, his vest, the ring, and all of that, were still being worked on. Now, I want to focus on this specifically because I think it's a really important point of skill that all of the actors in this production displayed, but here might be one of the most stark examples of it. Considering this is Stanley's first day on set, but it's also the end of his journey with Andy, i.e. the line, "I think my work is done," it's a testament to the skill of the actors and the work of Aline's writing, and of course David's directing, to be able to portray the sense of closure and completion in a scenario in which the actor has experienced none of what the character would be feeling via their performance throughout the production. The non-linear structure of a shooting schedule is a difficult factor for everyone, in particular the actors, and it's interesting to see just how everyone weaves in and out of shooting, and how they have to adapt to the portrayals of their character at different points in their journey. Now, David specifies that one challenge that became apparent as the shoot went on was that Anne was having to change her look drastically day to day, often going back and forth between pre- and post-makeover looks. Now, Florian details that this affected their schedule, as they began to realize that they needed to adapt the shooting schedule for her looks because it was way more of a strain on the shoot to shoot in the same location with her having different appearances than it would be to keep Anne in a similar look style and just change locations and go back into the locations after the fact when she has different looks. Which to you, as it is to me, may still sound surprising, but it's amazing how much effort goes into that on a daily basis. Now, on the opposite end of that spectrum was the coat throwing montage, within which the characters' outfits are constantly changing. Believe it or not, the scene was all shot in one day, with Meryl's half in the beginning of the day and Anne's half in the latter portion. Meryl would walk by, say her line, and throw the coat, and then immediately go change. And then 30 minutes later, they'd do the next shot. And that was repeated all day. And Pat adds that they added Emily in at the last minute, as she wasn't normally supposed to be in those scenes. And additionally, they only ended up shooting for 2 days in Paris itself, with all other Paris scenes having to be supplemented in either locations in New York or on sets. Now, to conclude this section on shooting schedules, David notes that the scene on the street at night with Christian and Andy in Paris is actually in Paris at Notre Dame, and this is the last scene they shot of the shooting schedule, day 57. Now, one small point of focus I would also like to add in here, which I think is a fun element of having Mark on the commentary, and makes me wish editors were more often included in the bonus feature information, was of his contribution to the discussion about how he played a part in ensuring certain shots were captured for the film. Now, much of this information is David himself bringing up that certain shots were requested by Mark, and then Mark explaining why. Some examples include the insert of Andy having a meeting at Elias Clark, which Mark clarifies that the reason he requested for the shot was because early on in the production schedule they decided to remove a scene from the script in which Andy goes to the wrong building, so he felt they needed something in there to tie things together after the original scene's removal. Another example was the close-up in the divorce conversation scene, with the motivation that they really needed to get inside Andy's head in that moment. And then Mark took it a step further and added a flashback, which David thought was very poignant. And as for getting into the heads of the characters, let's take a moment to focus on the actors' performances. Now, something that was more myth than fact for some time around the production of The Devil Wears Prada was whether or not Meryl Streep had decided to go method for the part. And long after the film came out, Meryl did finally confirm that she had in fact gone semi-method, with Emily and David confirming that she was colder than her normal on-set presence, but not totally unapproachable. Meryl adds that at one point, she was in her trailer and she could hear everyone else outside laughing and having a good time, and remembers being depressed by her choice in performance preparation, adding that, quote, "That's the last time I ever attempted a method thing." Wendy adds an example of the semi-method element that when Meryl walked in for the divorce scene, she didn't talk to anybody, did the scene, and then got up and went downstairs and waited for everyone else to be done. David adds that it was a very hard scene. Anne also adds in the Entertainment Weekly interview that despite the intimidation of Meryl's method on this project, she still felt very cared for. As she recalled while working with Meryl in their scenes, she watched as Meryl would change her performances ever so slightly, finding a way to pull something more out of her, and breaking her through whatever barriers she felt she had, and that meant a great deal to Anne. It also taught her a lesson, how despite Meryl being the number one on the call sheet, she still looked out for and protected the other actors and the film itself, because when everyone's doing great work, the film benefits as a whole. Now, on creating Miranda as a character, Meryl explains specifically in the Entertainment Weekly interview that Miranda behaves how horrible, powerful people behave, by disregarding the people at the lower rungs of the ladder, adding that the throwing of the coats was a particularly obnoxious touch because it, quote, "takes too much time to hand them over nicely." She adds that she didn't try to ingratiate, citing her friend Carrie Fisher's phrase of, quote, "the squeezy and tilty of it all," which Miranda very much didn't do. Meryl adds that it was a great character to play and hopes that we'll get to a point where women don't have to apologize for a request. Now, Meryl continues on in the Entertainment Weekly interview that the way Miranda behaved was a direct steal of how she saw Clint Eastwood run a set, being someone that guys really respect. She notes that he never raises his voice. Never. Providing supporting context of her experiences in drama school, where she learned that the way you play a king has nothing to do with you. You're just you. It's how everyone else in the room reacts when you enter it that makes you the king. And that was perfectly exemplified here. Meryl adds that she could just quietly go a bit nastier, semi-jokingly ranking herself normally at about a 7 out of 10 on the nastiness scale, but here she could go to a full 9 or 10 of nastiness. Now, Anne recalls in that same article that during the first read-through, after having read the script so many times, she expected Meryl to come in imperious, loud and barking orders, and that when she said her first line in a whisper, she almost fell off of her chair because it brought a deeper sense of reality to the character. She also felt that it was important not only for young women, but also young men to see her in this role, normalizing women in positions of authority like this, and providing an idea for what kind of leaders young men and women might want to be. Shifting focus slightly, David adds in the Entertainment Weekly interview that he likes to think that one of the reasons why the movie works so well on an emotional level is Anne's performance. He recalls that some of the most impressive prep work that she did during the moments before some of her more emotional scenes was when she would go off into a corner by herself, listening to Madame Butterfly, the opera, and going to her sad place, he adds. He recalls that she said, quote, "just roll the cameras and I'll walk in." And when she would do just that, she would arrive and do the scenes with genuine tears. Now, David continues that Anne's emotion in the scene being scolded by Miranda for not getting the flight back during the hurricane adds to the depth of the scene, commending her hard work of going off by herself, crying in the corner, and then pulling it back together to use it in the scene. Aline adds that for the scene with Andy and Nigel just after the scolding scene, they wanted to make sure that Stanley wasn't offering her help just to be cute after being held accountable by Miranda about the flight booking. David clarifies that Nigel is not a fairy godmother in any way, and Aline continues that he's actually being tough on her about what she's doing wrong. And it takes a minute for her to grasp what is being told to her, that it's a bigger world than just her, and she needs to be able to adapt in order to succeed. David adds that this, along with the cerulean scene, are two scenes in which Anne really doesn't have many lines, because she's just taking it all in, but he and Aline both commend that despite it, her reactions really make it a conversation, as you see her actively listening and you see the emotional responses come through. David says it's a gift of Anne's, that despite many scenes in the film where she's essentially being lectured, she's still able to convey emotion and comedy through a silent performance. For added context, Mark adds that Anne was actually very sick in real life during the divorce scene in the Paris hotel, and yet she delivered an amazing performance nonetheless. Now, David adds that the dinner scene near the end of the film between Andy and Christian was shot for a long while just to let the two actors do their thing, and it works really well in the close-ups. We'll get to another reason why it's only close-ups a little later. But as for an important point for Nigel, Wendy prompts David to clarify in the commentary the instance of initial confusion for Stanley about whether or not Nigel knows before the scene where the promotion is announced that he's not getting the job. And David confirms that he discussed with Stanley beforehand that, quote, "No, you don't know ahead of time. You find out in this moment. Imagine you're at the Academy Awards and you're just finding out that you didn't win." And Stanley said, "I can do that." David adds that throughout the shooting, in each scene other than the conference room scene, they were given a lot of variations that allowed for a lot of latitude in the cutting room. And Mark confirms that. And finally, in one of the more controversial conversations in the film, Adrian admits in the Entertainment Weekly interview that he didn't see some of the nuance and the subtleties of his character until watching the reception of the film. And through that, and reflecting on it, it occurred to him that Nate was an example of somebody who hadn't yet matured, while Andy had, adding that he was as immature as Nate was at the time, which is part of why he didn't see it, and that Andy needed more from life than Nate was giving her. Now, Adrian recalls a specific kissing scene where Anne was noting that it didn't quite feel right, and Adrian, recalling his immaturity at the time, wasn't able to understand what she meant. And she elaborated that she felt that they shouldn't be this lovey-dovey at this stage in their relationship, that there was too much history, and that they were too familiar. And inevitably, Adrian realized that Anne was right. And as a result, they went less intimate with the scene. Now, this leads us into a discussion about how the actors had an influence on not just the small, unwritten elements of their character in a given scene, but even had a voice in changing the words on the page themselves, usually through the practice of improvisation. As one of the most quoted points of improvisation in the film, we look at the beginning of the picture in which Nigel turns to the hall to warn those in the building of Miranda's incoming arrival. David adds that they shot a lot of alternatives to the "gird your loins" line, such as "man your battle stations," "incoming," "tits up," and more, of which you can see in the bloopers and outtakes of the bonus features on the DVD, along with many more entertaining elements of the film's production. As for one specific change to the script that Aline recalls, when writing the end scene, she added the line, quote, "Everyone wants to be me" for Miranda, which Meryl pushed back against, noting that Miranda isn't that vain. And upon reflection, Aline realized that Meryl was right. And she agreed, discovering that Miranda's focus isn't on herself, it's on the world of fashion. And she changed the line to, "Oh, don't be ridiculous, Andrea, everyone wants this." And at the final table read, Meryl added, quote, "Everyone wants to be us." David also notes that the friend group cast had a wonderful chemistry from the get-go, with a lot of ability to improv, including the end of the first scene together, where they cheers, which was not in one of the 12 different variations of the scene originally written, confirmed by Aline as well, as David kept asking for new versions. But it was Anne who improvised the cheers line to "jobs that pay the rent." And Mark notes that it was interesting to watch as an editor, as they went through different takes and slowly honed in until it all came together as it is in the film. Aline adds that she likes the choice that Emily made to have her character be in the back of the scene witnessing Andy's humiliation early in the film, and David confirms that that decision was all Emily's, just deciding that she needed to be in that scene. David goes on to comment that Miranda styling the dress being held by the model during the cerulean scene as if it were on a mannequin was actually Meryl's idea. And as she went through the monologue, she would tie in clothes that she added to the outfit to clothes that were mentioned in the script, such as when a jacket is mentioned in the lines in the script, she would then ad-lib in, "We need the jacket here," for the outfit that she was building. Aline adds that Meryl really wanted people to see what an editor would do and how they might put a look together, continuously tying into her performance choice of assuring focus was on Miranda's job. Now, David also adds that the scene of Nigel helping Andy and giving his backstory originally went on a lot longer, with Anne beginning to get more desperate and more pleading, and despite it, David had wanted to make it even longer, but Stanley was the one who insisted that he not, that the scene was perfect as it was. Pat adds that his timing on the delivery was perfect. Now, in the commentary, Mark asks whose idea it was to have the pencil in Stanley's hand, waving it around and pointing it at Anne, and David confirms that it was Stanley's idea, joking that, quote, "I didn't actually direct the film, I just showed up and got a paycheck and did nothing." And Wendy adds that he just let other people do the work. And despite this very much being a joke, it is really a testament to what it means to be a director. If I'm recalling right, I feel like I've said it before, but sometimes the most important part of directing is assembling the right team, because once you've done that, and if you've done a thorough and clear enough job of explaining what your vision is, you often don't need to do much else if you've surrounded yourself with a talented group of people. It was Orson Welles who often commented that many bad directors had prolific careers because of this exact phenomenon. Despite their lack of talent, they were able to surround themselves with enough talented people to keep their careers successful. This is also somewhat echoed in the opposite format by Christopher Nolan, who describes the casting process as being like 80% of the production of the film, because once you have the correct cast, it makes the process of production a lot more seamless. That's part of why he doesn't really give a lot of notes, as some of you may have been familiar with from anecdotes of people like Gary Oldman and other people who have worked with him, who acknowledge that he is very specific and brief with his notes. And part of that isn't necessarily just because he's great at notes, which he is, but it's also because he was capable of explaining his vision ahead of time and hiring people he knew that he had the confidence in to be able to understand it and perform. Now back to the film at hand. In the following scene with Adrian and Andy, David also adds that Adrian's line, quote, "take care of that finger," was also ad-libbed. And Aline continues that Adrian, as an entrance to a scene, was always adding something. And David confirms this, noting that it would give a greater context to the world around them. In another instance of David wanting more but the actors wanting less, David wished the scene with Miranda giving instruction by the car had more things listed, but Meryl felt it should only be 2. And David was too intimidated to ask for more, remarking that Wendy wasn't on set that day, so they had to manufacture a moment where Andy shows she deserves the key. Now, the idea of putting the book on the floor when Andy interrupts the argument between Miranda and her husband was actually Anne's idea. And Alina adds that Meryl insisted on her character working throughout the scene in which she tells Andy she's coming to Paris with her, instead of Emily, showing how despite this being a monumental moment for Andy, it's just another point in which Miranda is trying to get what she wants for work, not even looking up from the book. Aline also adds that when she wrote the divorce scene in the hotel, she thought it was pretty slim at the time, but that if Meryl wanted more, she would ask for more, but she never did. And additionally, the end of the following scene in the Parisian hotel with Andy and Nigel, where Anne says size 4, from that point forward in the scene, that's all ad-libbed by the two actors. And David notes that it was pleasantly surprising to see just how good their chemistry was, even that early in the shooting schedule, as we mentioned previously. As for the final scene of the film, Aline notes that she and Meryl talked about this scene a lot, and a few days before it was shot, Aline asked Meryl if she wanted any changes. Meryl said that she just wanted less. She always wanted things to be simpler and more streamlined, and so they did. David adds that he thinks this is the most beautifully written scene in the film. And it was wonderful watching the scene of the two great actresses sitting in half of a car during the last week of the shoot with two great characters facing off at the end of the film, like, as he acknowledges, on the waterfront. He adds that, to him, the scene played even with just the green screen in the background, but then adding Paris behind it brought it to a whole new level. Alina also comments that she loves the line, "go," that Miranda gives to the driver, specifically that it is her favorite in the entire film. But despite all the changes based on improv from the actors, there was a lot that changed just by the production crew as the filming went on. For example, Aline specifies that they tried to put the explanations of the book and Paris into different parts of the script, but they ended up blending them together into the one scene with Emily explaining it early in the film. She also adds that there was much discussion over when Miranda should start calling Andy by her actual name as opposed to Emily, and Wendy adds that it was an element that was well set up in the book, but you couldn't wait as long as they did, which was about 200 pages. David adds that they did a lot to ensure many noteworthy designers were referenced in the dialogue throughout the film, constantly changing who was mentioned and when. And Aline continues that the elevator scene in which the chairman of the board asks Nigel about the reshoots of the photography, which was something that had been floating around in Aline's head for months, when they finally decided to use it near the end of the shooting schedule. And David adds that they ended up having to construct a set to film it because they didn't get a chance to do it on location earlier in the schedule. But he felt it was an important piece to show early on in the film that even Miranda had a boss, and that there was somebody who would care that $300,000 was being wasted on a reshoot for the magazine. Now, Wendy notes that the scene with Andy and her father had about 3 to 4 different variations that were all done by Aline on the shoot day. And then moving forward once again, for the little fashion show for the magazine collection by Holt, David notes that they ended up having to give 2 pages of dialogue to Daniel on the morning of the day, Aline confirming that she wrote them on vacation, and that he had struggled to memorize them. Understandably so. David also adds that they discovered on the day that they hadn't hired enough models, so the second AD, Mike Pitt, had to run around Soho trying to find people for the scene. The model in the blue dress was actually a PhD candidate from Columbia who happened to be walking her dog, and Mike asked if she was a model, to which she replied that she had used to be, and he asked her if she'd be willing to be in a movie with Meryl Streep. It's amazing how far that question gets you on a production like this. Moving forward, Alina notes that she had intended to put a scene in the section after Andy gets the key to Miranda's apartment where she sings along to a song to herself, for a trailer moment, as David puts it, but he goes on to add that they all found it just way too painful to shoot. David also adds that the scene in the editorial meeting was originally much shorter, but it was lengthened in part due to Meryl's insistence on seeing Miranda actually work. And as a result, David came to think that it would be fun to shoot an entire editorial meeting. He adds that it's tricky because there isn't much narrative content until Emily comes in at the end of the scene, but it shows a lot of Miranda's character, specifically her power and her strength in this setting. And Florian adds that it also shows her inability to be pleased, and Nigel's position in the business. Aline continues to explain that she had written various events that Andy had missed over the course of time, as different scenes that ended up not being used. They were even planning to shoot a scene in which she shows up to Nate's birthday dinner late, but they had to cut it from the schedule because they ran over on other parts of the production. David adds that the scene with the cupcake ended up taking a surprisingly long time, over half a day, attributing it to having just come back from Paris. Aline also adds that the line about if she were a man was an important thing to add for both her and for Wendy. Probably the most dramatic point in script changes was when David got a call from the studio during production demanding that they cut 10 pages from the film. In response, David, Aline, and other members of the crew ended up going through and trying to strike as much as they could, including some flashbacks that were intended to be in there, and some exterior scenes in Paris. But it got to the point where David went to the producer and said, quote, "We can't cut anything else. We have to do these scenes. I don't care if we can't afford it, it needs to be done." And it became a real struggle for the production. And part of those Paris scenes was one in which Aline notes that they had always debated, which was how much material was needed after throwing the phone into the fountain. They began to realize that there were a lot of people Andy needed to make amends with, and the audience would want to know which direction she was going in. From an interesting perspective on the collaboration between screenwriter and editor, two people who are normally separated completely by decisions made during the actual production of the film, Mark adds that there were a few ways that the scene between Andy and Nate as they were reconciling could have ended, and Aline adds that she often designs scenes in that way, where you can later decide, quote, where to pull the ripcord, whether it be line 2, line 6, or anywhere else. She also adds that this scene was important to show as a relationship of two people in their early 20s, where people are figuring out their lives and whether or not it will or won't line up with the person that they're with. David notes that the scene of Andy calling Emily was added about halfway through shooting, spurred by Elizabeth Gateway saying that it had been a while since they'd seen Emily, and it'd be a shame to not see her again. Wendy adds that they thought people would be curious about what happened to the clothes. And as a final note on changes to the script, Aline adds in the Entertainment Weekly interview that the film originally ended with a much more definitive reconciliation between Andy and Nate, but Carla and Elizabeth at the studio really pressed her to make it more casual and less definitive. Now that we've discussed how the performances and the script fluidly affect and change one another, let's switch over to a brief discussion of the more technical elements of the film with the camera and lighting departments. Now, starting with the cerulean scene in the DVD commentary, David asks Florian about the scene being shot handheld, and he adds that he wanted it to feel a little bit more improvised, almost documentary style. And similarly, Florian commented on the difficulty of shooting the night scene conversation between Andy and Nate in the Tribeca area by the black sedan. Now, Florian doesn't elaborate on what he means by this, but I assume he means in relation to not just the wardrobe, but the foreground and the background all being dark or black, and trying to create visual separation between Andy as subject and the black car behind her and the dark street behind it, which he seemed to resolve by kicking angled light from outside of the frame left, and then using the various levels of reflectivity of the materials in the frame to create differentiation of lighting value. Now, David goes on to discuss the transition effect during the montage of Anne's different wardrobe right after her initial makeover. And this is kind of reminding me of the transitional cuts of Brody and Jaws on the beach early in the film. And he and Mark confirm that it was done practically, just with cameras and cuts. And Mark adds that it was an extremely difficult thing to do to be able to shoot it in order to get the seamless transitions, for everything had to be in its intended place. Now, Florian adds that the party scene in Holt's loft was really difficult, with David confirming that it was about 110 degrees in the loft, and an incredibly small area with very little room for anyone to go, especially the crew. Now, Lena then compliments David on his ability to make the shot of Miranda looking through the book interesting by using a dolly, referencing the quick dolly in on her in her office and then the dolly back out. He adds that a lot of the camera movement is out of desperation, always. Related, David notes that the push-in on Andy at the steps of Miranda's home was done in post to Florian's great distress. Florian adds that the oneer with Simon and Anne in the gallery debut was one of the few times that they really tried to do something in movement that would not rely on editing, and it felt right to embody the little seductive dance that Christian was doing around Anne, and he adds that the music, which David clarifies was a song by Bittersweet, really adds to the moment as well. Now, for the next scene, Wendy adds that she loves the way the Tribeca nighttime argument between Andy and Nate is lit, and Florian notes that it's from what they call the sparkly bits, which is all the little lights in the background that are out of focus that they tried to retain in the shot, while Wendy recalls that the Chinese lanterns that they used to light it also adds to the effect, both here and a mass of them throughout the entire production. Florian adds that they ended up having to use 2 cameras to get that scene done in order to have a prayer of capturing it, for something that I'll mention in a little bit once we get to the sound portion of this film. David adds that it also worked really well for Anne, as it saved her from having to overexert herself throughout constantly getting emotional and then reeling it back in, adding that you can really feel her pain in that scene. Now, moving further into the film, Florian specifies that the reason that the dinner scene between Andy and Christian is mostly in close-up, as I previously mentioned, is because that they had an issue with some of the footage going to the lab where it was lost, though he doesn't specify exactly how it was damaged, though he does comment on the fact that it was a shame because they did a lot of work throughout the production to make that French restaurant on the Upper East Side look like it was in Paris, with putting smart cars outside and an oyster guy, but unfortunately, because of the loss, none of it was seen. As for the actual location shooting in Paris, Florian adds that they struggled to find a way, with their limited time in Paris of only 2 days, to get a lot of the city without making it look like a postcard. So it became a bit of a fine balance for the production decisions. David adds again that the fact that it was Christmas time in Paris added to the sparkliness of the sequence. Now, the hallway scene right before the announcement event where Meryl gives her coat to Anne was apparently done 17 times. And one of those times was because David's cousin Jack accidentally walked into frame with a big white windbreaker, just trying to find his way off of the set, because a lot of David's family had come and visited him on set, and that became the whole thing. If you want to hear more about that, watch the actual DVD bonus features. Mark adds that the announcement scene itself was a difficult scene because it all had to be shot in a single day at the St. Regis top floor in New York, and it got to the point where the sun was going down, so they had to put fluorescents outside of every single one of the windows to retain the look of it being in daytime. Now, moving to a slightly more complex element of the shoot, Florian adds that they discovered as they were working with the car that it was very difficult to light the inside for the green screen scenes. So they inevitably made the decision to cut the car in half and remove the entire front portion to make space for the cameras and the lights. And they remark how they were initially hesitant to cut the $100,000 S-Class Mercedes in half, but they quickly learned from Mercedes themselves that it was a pre-production car, so they couldn't sell it anyway. So that became a lot less of an issue. Now, Florian also gives credit to his assistants David Bravo and Amanda Pollock for the attention to detail with the plates they used for the backgrounds for the car. They shot the interior shots first with the green screen in the background, and then they shot the plates when they went to Paris, then knowing exactly what angles and what lens lengths they needed in order to match appropriately. And with that, we conclude our discussion of the production portion of the film. So let's move over to the editing and other elements of post-production. As for the editing of the film itself, the major element of Mark's job involved having to remove scenes and parts of scenes. So let's cover some of the things that he had to trim down over the course of post-production. One example, as David notes, is that they cut a lot of scenes of Andy's first day down. David notes that they cut an earlier scene of Nigel, and Mark adds that they end up not learning his name is Nigel for quite some time in the film as a result. Aline notes that they all came to a conclusion about the dinner scene between Andy and her father that less is more, because everyone had had a moment like this where a child had done something a parent wishes they hadn't done, or at the very least that they wish they had done something differently. Now, David adds that there was a whole section of dialogue that was removed of backstory about Andy and initially planning to go to law school and her father being a lawyer, but they ended up streamlining it in the editing, realizing that the primary focus was that of the battle between Miranda and Andy. Now, David and Aline also add that some of the extras in that scene were people who had won a prize and they got to be extras in the scene as a reward for that. They don't really elaborate on that, but I thought that was kind of a weird, interesting thing in terms of like fulfilling needs on a production. I'd never heard of essentially extra lottery before, but good to know that that is a thing, I guess. Moving on, Mark adds that the scene between Simon and Anne in the loft when they first meet was originally a lot longer, with both characters being more confrontational to each other at first, but they decided to trim that out. Now, Wendy notes that they tried a few different versions of the Harry Potter book sequence, with and without the Christian Thompson poster on the bus going by. And Mark says that there was a whole scene where we were reintroduced to Christian in a cab that seemed redundant at the time, so it was cut. But they used the bus poster as a shot to substitute that scene that was removed. Now, David supplements that there were a couple moments in that sequence that were removed as well, such as a Starbucks order that went wrong where she decided to quit, and then she handed that Starbucks to a homeless man that was on the street, named in real life, Radio Man. And Wendy explains that Radio Man is a guy who goes around New York City and visits all of the movie sets because he listens to the radio frequencies that all of the different production crews use to communicate with each other. And he then figures out where everyone is from there. I don't necessarily recommend doing that yourself. You're probably going to run into issues if you do that. It was a different time. David goes on to note that the sequence of Meryl walking through the museum at the event was actually created in the editing room because it wasn't initially laid out in the script in any way whatsoever. It was just B-roll that they happened to get of Meryl walking around that Mark put together coherently. They also add that this scene was shot in a completely different order than how it ended up in the film, along with it having been significantly reduced in runtime. As for the Central Park photo shoot scene, that initially came right after the cupcake scene, but they ended up moving it forward. Now, Mark adds for the promotion event reveal scene, he tried to find as much as he could of Stanley being endearing and such, so that by the end of the scene, the knife really cut you hard and you could sympathize with him as much as possible. Now, with the discussion of a lot of the linear editing elements finished, let's transition to what some of you might not expect to hear a lot of in a film like this, which is the use of CGI and visual effects. Now, the main sources of visual effects for this film are found in the background plates for different sets, such as Miranda's office, Miranda's hotel room in Florida during the hurricane, the background of Christian's hotel room, and the backgrounds for some of the interior shots of the car driving through Paris. Now, I've mentioned previously some of these being existing VFX shots, but I want to go into a little bit more detail here about how exactly they were done. The crew focuses on the fact that the most difficult of these was probably that of Christian's hotel, as the real hotel room was in New York, from which they had to hang green screens outside of the window, but wasn't necessarily the easiest thing in the world because they were on the 7th floor. So that involves a lot of cranes, a lot of lights, a lot of safety equipment. It gets rather complicated when you start trying to light several stories above the ground in buildings that you then have to rig everything outside of. I know we previously touched on that a little bit with the St. Regis Hotel promotion scene, with the lighting having to be rigged in order to keep it maintaining a look of daylight. But the complexities of that change not only with the height, but also the locations of the individual buildings themselves. Now, David notes specifically that a lot of this work was done with their VFX supervisor, Randy Balsmeyer, using usually shots provided from the dedicated work of the second unit team on this production. Now, here I want to jump over to another important element of this film, and that is the music. David commends the score in the commentary, elaborating that they spent a lot of time figuring out the right cues for the music and the theme for Miranda. Theodore Shapiro was the composer for the film, and he has a long and prolific career in the film industry. Wendy adds that the cue of the Madonna song, Vogue specifically, was actually one of the first songs that was pitched on the production. And David contributes that she was chosen as for her relevance of being a fashion icon. Pat also chimes in here in the commentary that she thought Madonna was a great choice because she's someone within the fashion industry who really sets the pace, just as her music does here in the film. David also remarks on the U2 song when they first get to Paris, called City of Blinding Lights, which was their personal anthem during pre-production. The year prior to the release of the film, during pre, when he and Pat went to Paris for the couture shows, he shot some video of the city while they were there and edited together a little montage to that song, never thinking that they'd actually be able to use it in the film, and believes it really captures the feeling of someone going to Paris for the first time. Wendy adds that they were trying to figure out if they could afford to go during the actual shoot, and they were concerned about the fact that it was December and they had all of these Christmas lights up. And they decided afterward that those lights in fact actually added a lot to the film. And as a final note on music, for the divorce scene in the Paris hotel, David specifies that in the score, Teddy combines both the Miranda theme and the Andy theme as a bit of a subconscious, subtextual little commiseration on a sonic level. Speaking of sonic elements, let's hop from music over to sound mixing and design for the film. Now, this is one detail that is generally overlooked in film production, or oftentimes in the discussion of it. And in this film, much of the vibe of New York actually comes from not just the visuals, but also on a more subconscious level, the individual sonic elements that you hear representing the city. Now, during the commentary, Wendy asks Mark about the sounds of the city in this film, and he notes that when the production audio became a little tenuous because of all the background noise of the city, like sirens and such, they decided to go with it and let it be dirty, to add that layer of realism. Now, this is a bit unconventional, as normally when faced with parts of production that the crew doesn't have control over, they'll scrap that element and rebuild it from the ground up. Like, for example, here with sound, they would re-record each of the individual elements in a studio to better be able to manipulate it to get the exact desired outcome the team was looking for. But with this production, they opted not to do that. Another part of the uniqueness of this project and just deciding to go with it can be seen in the breakup scene between Andy and Nate, which David specifies was shot on Halloween night. And as a result, they were fighting an immense amount of background noise, with a parade, cars, TV crews, and helicopters for the parade all around them in Soho. Now, he really commends the sound department, in particular TJ Amara, for doing a terrific job of avoiding all of the chaos and only picking up what they really wanted to hear in that scene. Mark also adds that the mix by Tom Fletchman and the sound editing by Paul Emerson was wonderful as well. He also notes that the phone ringtone that they chose for the production that comes through during that nighttime Tribeca argument between Andy and Nate is a good representation of their decision to find the most annoying and intrusive ringtone that they possibly could, with everybody in the commentary joking that no one is ever going to use that tone again. Now, with the main points of the post-production covered, it is time now to finally jump over to when this film was released in theaters. Now, just as with the book, The Devil Wears Prada was a smash hit when it was released in theaters in 2006. Aline adds in the Entertainment Weekly interview that despite the fact that she knew the film was very respectful for the fashion industry, when Anna Wintour, the editor-in-chief of Vogue and the real-life inspiration for Miranda Priestly, came and sat in front of her and David at the premiere, she admits it was a bit intimidating. David also adds in that same interview that at the premiere, he noticed that Wintour's daughter was nudging her throughout the film, saying, "They got that right, they got that right," with very little reaction from Anna herself. Years later, when at a tennis tournament in Miami, he happened to be sitting right behind Anna, so he made the effort to introduce himself. And when he added that he was the director of The Devil Wears Prada, she whipped her hand right out of his. Giselle also adds in the Entertainment Weekly article that the movie is very accurate to how things ran at Vogue, especially at that time, where people are very dedicated and professional, but also knew that Anna was the final word, and that everyone wanted to please her, but that she believes that's true for everything. She concluded her thoughts by saying, quote, "Who doesn't want to please their boss? I think if you are any person who is a good professional, you want to please who you're working for." Now, David went on to commend the production designer Jess, specifically because considering nobody was actually able to get in and have a discussion with anybody at Vogue other than Jess, doing a single covert mission to figure out what the inside of the offices looked like, they found out after the film was released that they had replicated Anna Wintour's office so accurately that she ended up completely redesigning it for her real office as to separate her and herself from the film's representation of her in Miranda Priestley's office. And Lauren Weisberger confirms this in the Entertainment Weekly article, saying that they got the office really close to Anna's. As of now, the film sits with having received a final box office total, adjusted for inflation, of $326 million worldwide. And it sits at about a 75% on Rotten Tomatoes. But how has this film persisted in the culture since its release? As for the cultural impact of the film, Streep herself remarks in the Entertainment Weekly interview that part of the success of the film was due to the story hitting at a particular time where the discomfort with women being in high-ranking positions in the workplace was reaching a zenith in terms of the fact that women were not going away from their authoritative roles, and everyone needed to figure out how to make it work. Elizabeth explains her perspective in that same article, specifying that it showed that to have a film like this be so successful, it also had to appeal to men as well. And that part of such an appeal was that the models were attractive women, but also the curiosity of seeing a woman like Miranda Priestley at the top of the glass ceiling in a job which is usually reserved for men. Meryl continues that this is the only film in all of the years that she's been acting where men will come up to her and say, quote, "I know how you feel. I know how you felt. I have a company, no one understands me, it's really hard, etc., etc." And Stanley adds on to that, saying that in the Entertainment Weekly article, society has conditioned women to see the world, particularly in cinema, through men's eyes, and this film is one of the first to start to make that change. Now, as for professional impact, this film provided a bit of a beginning of a renaissance for Meryl Streep, sending her skyward until she hit orbit after doing the Mamma Mia films. Similarly, this was a big turning point in Anne Hathaway's career, marking the start of her journey as an A-lister. And for Emily Blunt, this was her breakout role. And of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, we now have the sequel, The Devil Wears Prada 2, for which I was hoping to have this video done prior to its release, but here we are. I still haven't seen it yet, but maybe you might hear my thoughts about that in comparison to this film in a podcast version of this show at some point in the not too distant future. I'm not making any promises, but maybe. That's about all I had for what I want to discuss about Devil Wears Prada. You know, again, this is one of those instances where I decided to match up a film with a sequel or an anniversary, something that was relevant to, you know, doing a video on a previous version of it. And I gotta say, another prime example of something where it's a movie that I've enjoyed in the past that I was not anticipating learning a lot from, but I will say the elements of script, of shooting schedules, of editing, and how all of those things were intertwined in this production, and how fluid a lot of the production was really interesting to find out. Considering a lot of the mentality of modern productions and also a lot of the advice that people get who are young in the film industry is that you have to have everything figured out before you step on set, which isn't a bad idea. It's important to show up prepared, but this is a good reminder, in my opinion, that sometimes different people work in different ways, and some productions actually require having that level of fluidity even throughout the production schedule. It's a good reminder that if you aren't somebody who sticks to the exact script that you have at every given moment throughout your shoot, that doesn't mean you're a bad director. It doesn't necessarily even mean that you did a bad job preparing. That's a different problem. It just means that maybe you're a little bit more like David. Maybe you're a little bit more like Aline or Mark, where as you go along, as you listen to the performances of the actors, as you listen to the input of all the other people that you've hired that you trust, you may discover that something better is on the horizon of the thing you're about to do. And you are comfortable enough to make that change and make the product better. I don't know. It's a nice thing for me to think about. I think it's worth ruminating on, especially for people who are interested in doing things like this. And that's the whole reason I made this channel. And it's an excuse for me to learn a little bit more about the craft that I'm still kind of trying to weasel my way into in some way, shape, or form. And, you know, it's a good way to educate other people who might be interested in it as well. You know, some people say the best way to learn is to teach, and I guess that is a little bit of what I am attempting to do here. So anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video on the making of Devil Wears Prada, and I look forward to seeing you next time, where I believe the next film I'm supposed to be doing is 2025 Superman, in hopefully the first time where we actually get a video out prior to the film that it's supposed to be pairing with, which is Supergirl, that's going to be coming out this June. So yeah, hopefully we'll see you in a couple weeks for the making of James Gunn's Superman, which I'm really excited about. And then we'll be getting into Troy later on before the Odyssey, Cliffhanger before that reboot. We got a bunch of other ones already scheduled out all the way till, I think, January of next year. So if you enjoyed this, check out some of the other ones we got on the channel, and consider hitting that subscribe button so you can see the other ones that we're planning on releasing throughout the rest of the year. Anyway, thanks so much, and hope to see you again here on Silver Retention.